The evening sun cast a warm golden hue across the city, painting long shadows over the sidewalks as people bustled home from their daily routines. Among them was Mira, a young woman in her early 20s with a quiet confidence and compassion that set her apart. Mira had always believed in small acts of kindness, helping her neighbors, assisting children with their schoolwork, and supporting her community in any way she could. That day, however, she had no idea that her life was about to change forever. Mira had just finished a long shift at the local cafe, where she worked to support her studies. Exhausted, she walked down the crowded sidewalk, her mind on the little things that had filled her day. The old man who ordered his usual coffee, the little girl who beamed at her while holding a balloon, the regulars who had come to know her by name. Lost in thought, she almost didn't notice the teenage boy a few steps ahead of her. He was a typical high school kid, wearing a hoodie, backpack slung over one shoulder, and wireless earbuds that blocked out the world around him. The boy was unaware that he had strayed dangerously close to the curb. Mira's eyes widened as she noticed a car speeding down the road, barreling toward the intersection without slowing. The driver was distracted, and Mira's heart raced as she realized the boy was in imminent danger. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as she dropped her bag and sprinted toward him, adrenaline surging through her veins. "Hey!" she shouted, but the boy didn't hear her, his attention lost in the music. Mira's feet pounded against the pavement as she lunged forward, grabbing the boy by his shoulders and yanking him back with all her strength. In that split second, the speeding car whizzed past them, so close that Mira could feel the rush of air as it passed by. The boy, startled, stumbled backward, nearly falling to the ground. He pulled out one of his earbuds and looked around, dazed. "What? What just happened?" he stammered, looking at Mira with wide eyes. "You were about to step into the street," Mira said, slightly breathless. "That car, it was going way too fast. Are you okay?" "Yeah, I think so." He glanced at her, a mixture of confusion and gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks. I didn't realize—" Just then, a commotion broke out nearby. An elderly man had been walking along the same stretch of sidewalk, and in the chaos of the moment he had tripped, hitting his head on the edge of a concrete planter. Bystanders rushed over to help, but Mira could see from the expressions on their faces that the situation was dire. Her heart sank as she realized that while she had saved one life, another had been lost in the confusion. As people began calling for help, the boy's expression shifted from gratitude to shock. He looked at the crowd surrounding the fallen man, then back at Mira, as if unable to process what had just happened. I didn't mean for this to happen," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to save you." But before she could say more, police officers arrived on the scene. They assessed the situation quickly, taking in the chaotic scene and the distraught expressions of the witnesses. Despite her desperate attempts to explain, Mira was handcuffed and placed in the back of a police car. As the boy looked on, frozen in disbelief, she caught his gaze one last time before the car door closed, her eyes silently pleading for him to remember what had really happened. In that moment, Mira knew her life was forever altered. She had acted on instinct, driven by a desire to protect. Yet she now found herself on the brink of a nightmare she couldn't have foreseen. Arrested and alone. The hours following Mira's arrest felt like an eternity. She was taken to a cold, stark police station, her wrists sore from the tight handcuffs. She could barely process what was happening. All she could think about was the man who had fallen, the life lost in a heartbeat. But just as haunting was the look in the boy's eyes, the boy she had risked everything to save. He had seemed confused, almost disoriented, and then simply gone. Mira sat in the small holding cell, her mind racing through the events that had led her here. She had never imagined that doing the right thing could end like this. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "Do good without expecting anything in return, and life will take care of the rest." Mira had always believed that, but now, as she sat alone in the grey cell, she began to wonder if that was true. Hours passed before she was allowed to make a phone call. She thought of calling her family, but feared the worry it would cause them. Instead, she chose to remain silent, hoping against hope that the truth would emerge, that the boy would come forward, or that witnesses would speak up. Her hands trembled as she clutched the phone, but there was no one on the other end to hear her cry for help. A police officer passed by her cell, her face hardened and uninterested, as though she were just another name in a long list. No one seemed willing to listen to her side of the story. In their eyes, she was already guilty. A judge without mercy. When morning arrived, Mira was escorted to the courthouse, shackled at her wrists and ankles. Her heart raced as she was led into the courtroom, where the towering figure of Judge Randolph Hastings awaited. The room was sterile and imposing, its walls lined with worn books and portraits of judges from generations past. Judge Hastings, seated high on the bench, was known for his unyielding approach to justice. But beyond his strict rulings, there were rumors about his biases, whispered among courthouse staff and lawyers who knew him well. As Mira was brought forward, she glanced at the faces around her. She saw a few familiar ones, witnesses from the scene who had seen her save the boy. And then there was the family of the elderly man, seated together in quiet sorrow. Yet when their eyes met hers, they did not look at her with anger or resentment. Instead, there was something softer, almost understanding. Mira clung to that, hoping it would help the judge see the truth, but Judge Hastings barely acknowledged her presence. He scanned the case file before him with an expression of disdain, a hardened line set in his jaw. To him, the details hardly mattered. He had made up his mind before she even spoke a word. His voice was cold and clipped as he began, "Miss, you stand here accused of reckless endangerment, resulting in the tragic death of an innocent man. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Mira's throat was dry, but she forced herself to speak. "Your Honor, I didn't mean for any harm to come to anyone. I acted to save a life. A boy was about to step into oncoming traffic. I only wanted to help." Judge Hastings barely reacted, his eyes flicking from her to the notes before him. "Regardless of your intentions, your actions led to a man's death. And the law does not pardon recklessness, no matter the circumstances." The family of the elderly man stirred, trying to catch the judge's attention. His widow, in particular, leaned forward, raising a hand in a silent plea. She wanted to speak, to explain that she did not blame Mira, that she saw the tragedy for what it was, an accident, but Judge Hastings cut her off, ignoring her quiet attempts to interject. Then, without allowing further testimony, Judge Hastings delivered his sentence. "I hereby sentence you to 100 years in prison, with no possibility of parole." His words echoed through the courtroom, final and merciless. As the sentence settled over her, Mira felt a wave of numbness wash over her. The witnesses looked stunned, and the elderly man's family exchanged glances of disbelief. The boy she had saved wasn't there. She realized now that he might never come forward. In a daze, Mira was led out of the courtroom, her mind struggling to accept the weight of what had just happened, a family's heartache. That evening, Judge Hastings returned home with a sense of grim satisfaction, recounting the details of his day to his family as they gathered for dinner. He described the reckless young woman who, in his eyes, had caused unnecessary tragedy. His wife, Evelyn, listened silently, her face troubled by the severity of his actions. She had often seen this side of her husband, a side that was quick to pass judgment and slow to show compassion, especially when it involved people who didn't look like them. His son, Aaron, sat at the table, unusually quiet. Aaron was a thoughtful teenager who had always been taught the value of right and wrong, though he didn't always see things as black and white as his father did. Tonight he seemed lost in thought. His fork paused mid-air as he listened to his father talk about the case. As Judge Hastings continued his story, pride evident in his voice, Aaron's mind began to piece together fragments of memory. He thought back to that day, the street, the sounds of screeching tires, and the image of a woman grabbing him, pulling him back, just as he had nearly stepped into danger. He hadn't said anything at the time, too shocked to process what had happened. It hadn't even crossed his mind that the woman who saved him might be in trouble because of him. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. The girl his father had sentenced, the one he had described so coldly, was his savior. He felt a surge of guilt, an unbearable weight settling on his chest. He looked at his father, whose eyes held none of the doubt or regret that now plagued Aaron. That night, Aaron couldn't sleep. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, feeling a gnawing sense of responsibility. How could he have stayed silent when someone else was suffering because of his mistake? He knew he couldn't let things remain this way. He had to do something, even if it meant facing his father's wrath. The revelation. The next morning, Aaron couldn't keep the truth hidden any longer. As his parents sat at the breakfast table, he gathered his courage, his hands trembling slightly. Clearing his throat, he looked directly at his father and began, "Dad, I need to tell you something about that girl you sentenced yesterday." Judge Hastings looked up, surprised by Aaron's serious tone. "What is it, son?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. Aaron hesitated, feeling the weight of his words before he spoke. "That girl, Mira, she saved my life." He saw the shock register on his father's face, but pressed on, describing the events in detail. "I had my earbuds in, and I didn't see the car coming. She pulled me back, Dad. If it weren't for her, I would have been hit." His voice softened as he continued, guilt evident in every word. "She didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. She was just trying to help me." Judge Hastings' expression shifted from surprise to disbelief, then to something darker, realization and a creeping sense of shame. The pride he had felt the previous night faded as the reality of his mistake took root. He had sentenced an innocent young woman, one who had saved his own son's life, without so much as listening to her side of the story. He had been blinded by his assumptions, his biases clouding his judgment. Evelyn, who had been listening quietly, reached for her husband's hand, her eyes filled with disappointment and empathy. "Randolph," she said softly, "you need to make this right." Judge Hastings sat in silence, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. For the first time, he felt the deep pang of regret. Regret not only for his hasty decision, but for the prejudice that had led him to that moment. He nodded slowly, unable to meet his son's gaze, and murmured, "I'll see what I can do." Determined to make amends, Judge Hastings called for an emergency hearing the following day. The shame he felt was a burden he could hardly bear, but he knew he had to face Mira and correct the wrong he had committed. He was resolved to do what he could to restore her freedom, no matter the cost to his reputation. Heartfelt redemption. The next day, Judge Hastings took his seat in the courtroom, his heart heavy with guilt and anticipation. He had arranged for Mira to be brought back, his request for a rehearing surprising his colleagues. Whispers filled the room as people wondered why he had reopened the case so soon after passing such a harsh sentence. But Judge Hastings hardly heard them. His focus was on one thing, setting things right. When Mira was brought into the courtroom, her face held a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. She looked around, confused and wary, before her gaze settled on Judge Hastings. For a moment there was a flash of recognition in her eyes, a spark of the pain she had endured, but she remained silent, waiting for him to speak. Judge Hastings cleared his throat, his voice quieter than usual. "Miss Mira," he began, "I've called you back here because I need to correct a grave mistake I made. Yesterday, I sentenced you without truly listening to your story. I allowed my own biases to cloud my judgment, and for that, I am deeply sorry." Mira's eyes widened, shock and cautious hope flickering across her face. The courtroom was silent, every person in the room hanging on his words. Judge Hastings continued, his voice thick with emotion. "What I did was wrong. I now know that you acted out of bravery and compassion. My son Aaron was the boy you saved. He has shared with me what truly happened, and I realize now that you put yourself in harm's way to protect him." His voice wavered slightly. "I can never undo the injustice you've experienced, but I can begin to make things right." He paused, taking a deep breath, then looked at her with genuine remorse. "Mira, you are free to go. Your sentence is overturned." A soft murmur spread through the room as the spectators processed what they had just witnessed. Mira stood still, her eyes filling with tears, not of fear or sorrow, but of relief and gratitude. She had entered the courtroom expecting nothing but more suffering, but now, as she looked at the judge, she felt a glimmer of hope. Judge Hastings watched her carefully, seeing for the first time the depth of her strength and courage. His heart was heavy with regret, but he felt a new resolve to become a better man, to question his own judgments, and to be the father that his son could look up to. As Mira walked out of the courtroom, free at last, she glanced back at him. In her gaze, he saw something he hadn't expected, forgiveness. And in that moment, Judge Hastings understood that while he had freed Mira, she had also freed him from the weight of his prejudice, a legacy of courage and forgiveness. As the years passed, Mira's story grew beyond the boundaries of her neighborhood, inspiring people from all walks of life. She became a local legend, a symbol of quiet courage and the power of forgiveness. Schools, community centers, and even local courts shared her story as a reminder of what true strength looked like, not just the kind that saves lives, but the kind that finds forgiveness in the face of injustice. Judge Hastings, transformed by his own journey, devoted the rest of his career to advocating for justice reform and racial sensitivity in the legal system. He led workshops for new judges, sharing Mira's story as a way to show the real consequences of prejudice and the importance of empathy. His humility and willingness to acknowledge his faults began to repair his reputation, and he became a better judge, one committed to fairness and equality. Mira, too, found her calling in sharing her experiences. She traveled to schools and youth centers, mentoring young people on courage, resilience, and the power of empathy. Her life was no longer just her own. It had become a beacon for those who faced adversity, a light for those who struggled under the weight of injustice. She remained grounded, never seeking fame, but always guided by a simple mission: to be a voice for those who felt unheard and to remind others of the strength found in forgiveness. Through their journeys, Mira and Judge Hastings left behind a legacy that would ripple through generations. They had each shown that true justice is not just about the law. It is about humanity, understanding, and the courage to grow beyond one's mistakes. Together, they demonstrated that change was possible and that even in a flawed world, people have the power to write a new story. The story of Mira and Judge Hastings teaches a profound lesson about the power of empathy, courage, and forgiveness. It reminds us that true strength lies not just in standing up for ourselves, but in showing compassion, even toward those who have wronged us. Mira's bravery in saving a life and her grace in forgiving a great injustice reveal the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of forgiveness. Judge Hastings' journey shows that even those who make grave mistakes can find redemption when they confront their biases, accept responsibility, and choose to change. The story calls on each of us to look beyond assumptions, to treat others with fairness and understanding, and to remember that everyone has the potential to grow. In the end, the story is a call to act with kindness, to seek the truth before judgment, and to believe in the possibility of change, both in ourselves and in others.